This lesson is reading configuration settings efficiently. The objectives for this lesson are to add settings to the app settings file, retrieve those settings, and create a class to hold those settings. With ASP.NET, you can choose where your configuration settings are stored. You then use a specific provider to determine how those settings are read and from where they are read. For example, they can be read from a JSON file. They can be read from environment variables, an Azure Key Vault or app configuration, command line arguments, directory files, in-memory .NET objects, or it could even be some sort of custom provider that you create. Maybe you're going to go and read it from a database table, for instance. But you can configure through some settings where configuration settings are stored. For this lesson, we're going to use configuration files. And there's two files. There's appsettings.json and there's appsettings.development.json. One is for when we're running in production mode and one is for running in development mode. And we've already shown you how to switch between the two different profiles. Now the values that are in those are taken from one or the other, and it just depends on which mode you're running in. What we're going to do is we're going to store settings in our appsettings.development.json. The first one we're going to do is a JSON object that has a default informational message. Remember that info message that we set that said, problem attempting to something using the something API, please contact your system administrator? We're going to store that in here, and we're going to use those couple replaceable parameters, verb and class name. The name of this object is AdventureWorks API. Then there's a colon, and then there's info message default, which is another property. And then the value is the problem attempting to, right? So the AdventureWorks API and then the info message default are what we need to get to. So to do that, we inject an IConfiguration interface. And we can pass it into the constructor of our router. We can pass it into the map-get method that we're using. Really doesn't matter as long as what we can do then is use a config variable that is of the type IConfiguration, and then we go after the property. So in this case, it'd be AdventureWorks API info message default. And that's what we can then return back if we had a mapping like this. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's add the configuration settings. Let's inject that configuration object, and then let's read the settings. So open up the appsettings.development.json file. At the top or somewhere in here, you're going to do AdventureWorks API info message default. And then there is that string that we always want to use, and then we'll replace it with like a get and then the class name might be product, router, or something like that. Let's come over here to our router classes and let's add a class called config test router. And it's going to be just like all of our other router classes where we do a public class, config test router, inherit from router base. We have our constructor to which we inject the logger. We set our URL fragment, our tag name, and then we override the add routes. And down in here we do an app.mapget, passing in the URL fragment, and then IConfiguration test will be the route name. We're also going to have ASP.NET inject the IConfiguration object called config. And we'll do a results.ok on config, and then within the square brackets, we do our path to get to the value in the info message default, which in this case would be AdventureWorks API info message default. Now, once we've got this config test router, of course, we need to go back to our program and we need to register this. So you got to make sure whenever you create a new router, you have to add it to the service container so that it can be a part of dependency injection, which means we can then run the application and it will now show up in our list of APIs. Click on the configuration test, and if we've done everything correctly, we should see down here a 200, and the response body is that message that we got from our configuration file. So instead of just reading individual properties one at a time, let's actually read these settings into a class. So what we'll do is we'll add a couple more properties to the JSON object in our appsettings.development.json. So let's add on the product category ID and a product model ID. And then do you remember the AdventureWorks API defaults class we created earlier? Those two properties are actually in there. So what we'll do is we'll add the other property, InfoMessageDefault, to that class. And then we'll create an instance of that AdventureWorks API default and fill in all the properties. So let's go ahead and do that now, where we add the new properties and we'll fill in the properties to that defaults class. So go back to your development.json file, add a comma at the end, and then put in your product category ID and the product model ID. Once you have that, let's go over to the AdventureWorks API defaults under the entity layer, and let's add the InfoMessageDefault property and go ahead and make sure you initialize that. So let's go back to the config test router and let's add a new map get here in the add routes. So in this guy here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new mapping called set properties. We're then going to use that AdventureWorks API defaults. So make sure you add a using. Okay. Once you then have that, we're passing in the configuration just like we did on the other one. Once you have that AdventureWorks API settings equal new, what we can do is we can use that config class now to grab each individual property from the config and assign it to the appropriate properties in the class. And then we can now return that settings class. So that's kind of nice, being able to take these values from the development.json file and assign it into the properties of a class. So if we go ahead and run this, now we can do the set properties, try it out, execute. There's our response body. It has the created date that this class was created, the InfoMessageDefault, the product category ID, and the product model ID. They're all coming now from the JSON file. Actually, if you have a class and that class matches the properties in the JSON object exactly, guess what? You don't need to read the individual settings like I just did. There's actually a method built into the configuration object called getRequiredSection. You then specify AdventureWorks API and then get a AdventureWorks API defaults. That's our class. And guess what? It goes ahead and matches up the property names and it'll automatically assign them all at one time. So let's take a look at how we do that. So once again, in the config test router, let's add another route. This one will be called assign to class. So again, we pass in the IConfiguration. Now this time, instead of creating a new instance of the AdventureWorks API defaults, we're just declaring it. And then look at line 29, where settings equals config.getRequiredSection ADVWorks API. So that's that property in the development.json file. And then we call the get method here, passing in AdventureWorks API defaults. And again, if we've done everything correctly, now when we return this settings class, we should get exactly what we got before, but we did it all with a single line of code. So let's go ahead and do this assign to class here, try it out, execute, and voila, we see the same response body, but much less code. Now, configuration settings don't change that often. So what you might want to do is instead of passing that configuration object into each method, you might want to read the settings one time in Program.cs. Let's take a look at how you do that. Open your Program.cs and underneath the Add and Configure Services area, let's read the AdventureWorks API section and let's add it as a singleton. So here I'm creating a new instance of the settings. I'm then doing builder.configuration.getSection AdventureWorks API .bind to that settings class. Then once we have that, we can do a builder.services.addSingleton and pass in the settings. So the binding actually takes those values again. It's another way to get those values, assign it to a class, and then add that class as a singleton. So once you have that, what we can do is we can open up our config test router class again, and we can add yet another mapping here. And this time what we can do is just simply inject the AdventureWorks API defaults as settings. And then look what I'm going to do. I'm going to, on line 27, settings.InfoMessageDefault equals settings.InfoMessageDefault.replace the verb portion with the uppercase word get, and replace the class name with config test router. Let's go ahead and now run this. And when we now do the inject defaults and we try this out, now you can see down here the response body. We get the problem attempting to get using the config test router API. So now I've done the actual replacement, but we see that the same values got read out. They just got read in the Program.cs. In this lesson, we learned to store global settings into a JSON file. We learned how to read those settings from that JSON file one at a time, and we also learned how to map those config settings to an object. Coming up next, configure and format JSON data.